Pastor Monica, in our first two videos, we looked at some of our early houses of worship, the original class meetings in the home on Oakland Avenue, as well as our church up on Prospect Avenue. And these places, these buildings, are important to the history of our church, but equally important are the people who came before us and the people that are part of our congregation today. The tens of thousands of parishioners over the years who've attended and contributed to the life of the church, the many people young and old who shared their gifts and talents, who provided financial support to the church, and who joined together in worship. Also, I think it's important to recognize the contribution of our pastors, those who stood at the pulpit to preach God's word, the clergy who celebrate us during happy times and comfort us and provided words of encouragement during difficult times. The men and women called by God to lead this wonderful institution we call West Grove United Methodist Church.
Absolutely, Scott. It is a privilege that we serve together as God's people. I find myself thinking about the Apostle Paul's writing to the church at Corinth. In the first letter, the 12th chapter, it's the 4th through the 6th verses, he says this: "Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. Varieties of activities, but the same God who activates in all of them. To each is given the manifestations for the common good." For the common good is what the people of West Grove have lived out over the last 130 years and still live out today. I think about so many people who serve in our church.
So Pastor Monica, in addition to the people, let's think and let's talk a little bit about some of our pastors. When you joined us here in June of 2014, you became the 40th pastor to serve here at West Grove. As was typical with Methodist ministers in the early years, our first 26 pastors, those that served between 1887 and 1942, they only stayed for about 2 years. Our shortest serving pastor was our pastor number 9, Reverend Kerr. He was only here for 4 months, not sure why, but a very short time. And our longest serving pastor was the Reverend Mel Lehman, who served here for 15 years, from 1984 to 1999. And the church experienced significant growth under Mel's tenure, and it was during that time that we built the new church, which will be a subject for our discussion in our next video. Our first female pastor was actually our 37th, and that was the Reverend Alice Cook, who was appointed to West Grove in 2004.
I give thanks to God for all of those clergy who serve faithfully, clergy who are blessed to serve aside those lay folks who've been so faithful. Now, I've had the privilege of seeing some of our old records, and I'm curious about a small newspaper called the Service Salute of West Grove Methodist Church. Could you tell me a little bit about its history?
Sure, Pastor Monica. That newspaper, which was more like a newsletter, was the handiwork of our 27th pastor, Reverend Cecil Thompson. Pastor Thompson was appointed here in 1942. And as you know, at that time, the U.S. had just entered World War II, and we had men and women fighting in both Asia Pacific and in Europe. So there are many young men and women in the church have been drafted into the military and were stationed either here in the U.S. or in many cases overseas. So Pastor Thompson started a newsletter, a way that he could keep in touch with the members of the congregation who had gone off to war. It began as a 3 or 4 page typed, mimeographed, stapled newsletter with stories about things happening in the church and around town. And of course, it included words of encouragement from our pastor. But after a few issues, and with hundreds of members of the greater Avon Grove community fighting overseas, Pastor Thompson decided not to restrict his distribution to just Methodists. He decided he'd send a paper to all servicemen and women from the West Grove area who were fighting in the military. So he actually upgraded his printing capabilities at that time. He had it printed on the printing presses at the West Grove Printing Company, so he was able to include pictures and more stories. And so to better connect with this expanded audience, Pastor Thompson would include letters written by other pastors in towns, Pastor to West Grove Presbyterian Church, or Father Kelly at the Assumption BVM Catholic Church. Pastor Thompson included in the paper the latest town gossip, what was happening in the halls of Avon Grove High School, which at that time was at the Avon Grove Charter School building. That was our first site of our consolidated high school. He had pictures from around town, and he would reprint letters that were mailed home from the men and women who were serving overseas. He also sadly would announce the death of those from the West Grove area who were killed in action, and he would pay tribute to the families that were left behind. And of course, in every issue, he would send his prayers, and he would ask for God's blessings on the troops and on our nation. Pastor Thompson noted on the cover of each edition of the Service Salute that the paper was, quote, dedicated to the interests of West Grove's young men and women in the service of their country. I'm sure the men and women in the military loved reading the hometown news and really appreciated West Grove Methodist support of the troops. The Service Salute kept them informed about what was happening back home, and I'm sure cured more than one case of homesickness.
I give thanks to God, Scott, for that way in which Pastor Thompson was innovative and contextually serving the people, particularly during World War II. I always imagine the role of a pastor to be a three-way relationship, a relationship between God, between the pastor, and between the people. The pastor who knows and loves the people in the midst of their foibles and their idiosyncrasies, and the pastor bringing them before God in prayer and discerning how is God speaking to them on a weekly basis and in a larger term as well. God who speaks and leads, who cares and encourages, who chastises and empowers, and the people who respond. This is a sacred trust. It's a relationship built on that kind of trust. I'm so thankful for Pastor Thompson and other pastors who found fun and creative ways to care well for people in the midst of war and in the midst of challenge.
Pastor Monica, I want to close with just one more quick story on Pastor Thompson. When Pastor Thompson arrived in 1942, we were still carrying debt on the building up on Prospect Avenue that we had incurred 12 years earlier, in 1930, when we built a Sunday school addition on the church on Prospect Avenue. So Pastor Thompson expressed his desire for the congregation to get out of debt, and he came up with an interesting way of raising the money. On one fall Sunday morning, members of the congregation arrived at church to find that there had been a wall built at the top of the steps blocking the front main entrance to the sanctuary, a brick wall. And Pastor Thompson informed the membership that they could knock down that wall by buying a brick at $10 a brick. Well, the congregation responded quickly, and the entire amount of the outstanding principal and mortgage, just over $1,200, was raised in less than a month. And as a result, in November 1943, Pastor Thompson and the trustees were able to celebrate and hosted a mortgage burning ceremony to celebrate that the church was now completely out of debt. Sadly, in 1949, as Reverend Thompson began his 8th year here at West Grove, he was admitted to the hospital in Philadelphia and died a few days later at the age of 41 from heart disease. His 6 pallbearers were all Methodist clergy, including Reverend Charles Montgomery, who was pastor at Landenberg and Hamilton Methodist churches, and it was actually Pastor Montgomery who replaced Pastor Thompson here at West Grove. When I think about the contributions of Pastor Thomas here at West Grove, I think about the verse in the Gospel of Matthew that says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." There are many other examples of great things our former pastors and their families have done over the years. Our 17th pastor, Reverend Doms, started the first Boy Scout troop in West Grove way back in 1918. Mrs. Myers, who was pastor of our 11th pastor, who was wife of our 11th pastor, was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in town, which, along with Quaker. The Quaker ladies were very active in stopping the West Grove Hotel from obtaining a liquor license in 1905. Our 18th pastor, Reverend Connor, he was a Coast Guard commander during World War II, and actually they named a ship in his honor that was based in Essington, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. The ship was named after Reverend Connor and in his honor. Pastor Monica, when I think about the role of a pastor, I think we ask a lot of our pastors. There are to be preachers, there are to be teachers, there are to be administrators, there are to be comforters, and there are to be counselors. So I just decided in one of our looks backs on the history of the church that we really needed to think about how blessed we have been with really great pastors over the past 130 years.